Welcome back to Winning Isn't Easy. Now, in the first part of this episode, I talked about the applicable standard of review and the nature of the evidence that's required to justify a claims denial and termination, and whether or not, as a result of them following the rules or regulations, they're entitled to deference. In other words, they can properly use the arbitrary and capricious standard of review. That's important because the standard of review is going to make all the difference between whether or not the court upholds the denial or terminates the decision to terminate benefits. So we've established this particular important principle. What is the standard of review? Now, in this next segment, I'm going to be talking about how disability carriers respond to a disability policy holder's perception of risk associated with full-time work. And I think that it's important, again, that you understand that many times in cardiac cancer or COVID claims, there is a disagreement between the disability carrier and the policyholder or beneficiary about the risk of injury and relapse associated with full-time work. On the one hand, you, the policyholder, are concerned about immunological risk, fatigue, or concentration issues, and whether or not you're actually capable of engaging in full-time employment. The carrier doesn't want to pay a dime more than they have to, and they think that it's easy to take the position that it's your perception of risk that is causing you to say that you can't work. So where's the intersection here between full-time work and the perception of risk? Now, the disability carriers, particularly when we have these kinds of diseases, are going to look at that perceived risk of intolerance to work, be it because of fatigue, pain, as opposed to actually what's going on. So the carrier is going to be asking your provider about your restrictions and limitations and whether or not those restrictions that they've assigned are based on your perception of the risk as opposed to the risk associated with the underlying medical condition. Now, this often ends up in federal court, and an example of this is the Kurzman versus Unum case. It's out of the state of Washington. Dr. Kurzman was an emergency room physician at Harborside Medical Center, and she was diagnosed with stage 4 metastatic breast cancer. That has a 27% survival rate after 5 years. The cancer had metastasized to her liver and her ribs. She took a full year off of medical leave. She underwent chemotherapy, a lumpectomy, hormone treatment, even a liver ablation. So 1 year later, with the approval of her doctor, she goes back to the emergency room on a 50% schedule with no night shifts. Now, Unum had paid almost a year of residual benefits based on her reduced benefits. And then they terminated her saying, look, you can work full time. Now, Unum gave a number of reasons to justify the claims denial. And it's not uncommon that they will create reasons to justify the claims denial. Now, Unum improperly argued that exercising during yoga or vacationing with her family were inconsistent with her complaints of fatigue, which was the reason behind the whole 50% schedule. And they also ignored the obvious immunological issues while working in an emergency room setting. Obviously, she was concerned of her exposure and how that might impact her breast cancer, and more importantly, how the treatment that she had gotten, which had reduced her immunological response, would cause her risk. Now, the starting point in many of these cases is what's the standard of disability? And you also have to look at whether or not there are any requirements for an attempt to return to work. And if that attempt was returned to work, whether or not the definition of disability looks at perceived risk. Most of them don't. More often than not, the judge is going to be looking at the medical records for history of problems with medication, fatigue, reduced immunological issues. And your medical records really have to speak to this increased risk associated with these types of medical conditions or the treatment. So there's got to be a clear history of symptoms, a clear history of functionality, a clear history of what the material and substantial duties are, what the risks are of increased symptoms or complications with full-time work or exposure to medical conditions that could cause other particular issues. So we have to address both medically and vocationally why there is this increased risk. I want your physician to be giving an affidavit that explains their qualifications, their expertise with these medical conditions, their medical opinions, the objective basis for the medical opinions, and medical literature that supports this increased risk. Now, this is crucial because the judge is going to have to be determining this increased perceived risk issue. And they're going to use that applicable standard of review that we talked about. So if we've got a medical condition where there is a real increased risk of injury or aggravation of a condition or developing a new condition, or there is a perceived risk, we just can't operate on the assumption that the disability carrier is going to appreciate that and continue to pay benefits. More likely than not, they're going to say that that perceived risk is nothing more than personal on your part, and it has nothing to do with the actual risk associated with a return to work. Again, it comes down to, in my view, medical proof and vocational proof, because we want the judge, if we've got the de novo standard of review, to go ahead and substitute their judgment for that of disability carriers like Unum. And if we don't have the de novo standard of review, we've got that arbitrary and capricious standard of review, we want the medical records and the vocational records to establish why this denial or termination was not well-founded factually, medically, or vocationally. We want to establish that it was unreasonable. So you can see that medical and vocational proof are key in perceived risk cases, and that the applicable standard of review is the key to winning your case. And in this case, the federal judge found in favor of Dr. Kurzman, finding that Unum's approach to this case was wrong and awarded her benefits. Got it? Well, I hope that you've enjoyed this week's episode of Winning Isn't Easy. Please like our podcast, subscribe to it, tell all your family and friends about it. And when you subscribe, remember you're going to get notice of the next episode. So I hope you've enjoyed today's episode, and thanks.